About autoimmunity and its pathophysiology. Today we will discuss about systemic lupus erythematosus, one of the autoimmune disease. Yeah. So we'll go with the definition. Definition and the prevalence. The definition is it's an autoimmune disease in which the organs and cells undergo damage initially mediated by tissue binding autoantibodies and immune complexes. So as we know, previously we discussed, there could be an antigen, self-antigen presenting as a virus to the antibodies, and there will be an antibodies against that antigen. There could be direct antibodies acting on that antigen on the organ, or there will be an antigen-antibody complexes formed somewhere, and they travel through the bloodstream and they deposit in the organs, leading to the immune complex reaction. So there can be both seen in the SLE. Normally, the self-antigens or the self-organs are reacted as foreign antigens. In the prevalence, it's more in the females and that too in the childbearing age. So what the pathogenesis? The pathogenesis mainly involves genetic, the most, or environmental factors and hormonal factors. But the most important thing is the genetical factors. The genetical factors, it's not that the single gene or a single defect leads to this disease, it's a multigenic disease where the upregulation of the genes due to the interferons is the signature. And this happens more in the peripheral brain in the most of the SLE patients. What happens due to this? There will be innate immune system hyperreaction leading to B and T cells, which further drive the autoimmune responses. So several environmental stimuli may also influence the SLE, like exposure to ultraviolet rays can lead to flares, lead to the cutaneous reactions, mostly involving the apoptosis in skill cells or altering the DNA in the intracellular proteins to make them antigenic. So the most important thing is the genetical thing, where it's a multigenic disease, and there could be an environmental stimuli also, which can lead to the DNA defects or they make them the antigenic. Next, we talked about hormonal. Hormones like estradiol, they bind to the receptors on T and B lymphocytes. So what happens then? Then there will be an increased activation and survival of those cells. Normally there will be apoptosis and the death of the cells. But what happens here in SLE is there will be less apoptosis, and the more time the T and B cells will be active. So the more time they are active, there will be more repercussions because of the T and B cells. So what happens is, especially autoreactive subsets, thus favoring prolonged immune responses. There will be some genes on X chromosome that influence SLE. So by this thing, we can say that why females are more involved than the males because of the two X chromosomes that we will be seeing. That's why people like with Klinefelter syndrome, when there is a double XY karyotype, they are much more involved with SLE. So a brief here, if you can see here in this slide, the predisposing factors on the left side, they are the genes due to deficiencies of complements or affecting antigen presentation or persistence, where you can see phagocytosis or immune complexes here. Or there could be genes for lupus nephritis, where there is involvement of renal system, or due to the environment, as spoken, like UV light or smoking or crystallines, or there could be epigenetics, like hypomethylation of DNA, histone modifications, or some increase in expression of predisposing genes, or the interferon production. So the predisposing factors, if you can see again, the genes are the most important one. The genetic thing, the genetic factors involving are the most important thing leading to the SLE. So what happens when these are involved? So when any of this is involved, there will be abnormal immune response. As we have spoken previously, there will be T cell and B cell production due to this antigens. Now this T cell and B cell along with complement, they form autoantibody immune complexes. Now this autoantibody immune complexes they deposit in the organs or they travel in the blood, leading to inflammation. And when this inflammation increases, leading to chronic inflammation and chronic oxidation, then you will be seeing the systemic disorders like the damage of the organs, the end organs, or you can be seeing atherosclerosis. So, what happens when there is inflammation? You can be seeing rash, arthritis, leukopenia. But when there is chronic inflammation and chronic oxidation, we'll be seeing damage of the organs, the systemic involvement, leading to renal failure, atherosclerosis, pulmonary fibrosis. So I want to stress it again here. This is the most important thing. The genetic factors are the predominant reason for the causation of SLE. Though there are environmental factors and other factors, hormonal factors, the genetic factors are the most important, leading to abnormal immune response, leading to formation of autoantibodies and immune complexes. This leads to inflammation and this leads to the damage. Here you can see production of increased quantities and immunogenic forms of nucleic acids and other self-antigens. So activation of T cells, and this leads to abnormal response that generate autoantibodies and immune complexes that deposit in the tissue, activate complement, cytokine production, and leads to inflammation and leads to irreversible organ damage. Over the time, the organ damage will be irreversible. So this means it's a fatal disorder. So some of the autoantibodies which are produced in the systemic lupus erythematosus. So there are so many autoantibodies produced, but the most important things here are anti-nuclear antibodies. Why? This is the best for the screening test. And there is anti-double stranded DNA, and anti-Smith and anti-Rho. So these are the four antibodies that you should remember along with the anti-histone. Because why I am specifically saying anti-histone is it is due to drug induced. So some drugs may also induce SLE, in which you will be seeing anti-histone antibodies. But whereas normally in all SLE patients, you will be seeing anti-nuclear antibodies like anti-double stranded DNA, anti-Smith. And the anti-Smith is the specific for SLE. So you can remember anti-double stranded DNA, anti-Smith, and anti-histone. The others are anti-Rho and anti-LAR, which are not specific, but when they are associated with other disorders like Zika syndrome and some other things, then you will be seeing these things. But anti-double stranded DNA and anti-Smith are most commonly seen. So what are the clinical manifestations? So the clinical manifestations can involve both cutaneous and systemic disorders. So musculoskeletal manifestations. So it will be involving both bones. So intermittent polyarthritis, characterized by soft tissue swelling and tenderness in joints, most commonly in hands, wrists, and knees. So there will be erosions in very few patients, but when there are erosions like rheumatoid-like criteria can also be fulfilled. Then when there is both rheumatoid arthritis and SLE, then we call it as rufus. Normally, you will be seeing non-erosive arthritis in most of the cases, but in very few cases, you will be seeing erosions also. And when there is rheumatoid-like features along with the SLE, then you call it as rufus. But in most of the SLE patients, you will be seeing non-erosive arthritis. But if the pain persists in a single joint, then a diagnosis of ischemic necrosis should be considered. A differential diagnosis if the patient is complaining of severe persistent single joint pain. So musculoskeletal manifestation, tenderness, joint pain, everything, but there won't be erosions in most of the patients. Non-erosive arthritis is what you'll see. But in few cases, there will be erosions also. So that next we'll talk about cutaneous manifestations. The cutaneous manifestations can be acute, subacute, or chronic. So what are the acute? Here you can see specifically in the picture here on the right side, there is a rash involving on the cheeks and the nose. Okay, this is a characteristic rash of the SLE. This is called butterfly rash. Here you can see this all area, it's not involved. The legs, the upper lip, the lower lip, the chin and all. But here you can see the most of the cheeks on the both sides and the nose, giving a butterfly wing appearance. So it is called butterfly rash. So it is the characteristic of SLA, the acute conditions, and there may be conditions where you can be seeing the ears or the V region of the neck or the chest, the upper back can also being involved. But SLE being the patients being mostly photosensitive, there will be raised erythema, occasionally scaling. This is acute, what I am speaking about. The next is subacute condition. Here you can see the lesion will be seen only in the sun exposed areas. So these are similar to psoriasis, where you can be seeing the scaly lesions type. Here you can see it's a bit scaly. The point here is these patients are extremely photosensitive. The moment they are exposed to sun, the moment they are exposed to UV light, you will be seeing the erosions being formed on the skin. And they are mostly red, dark red or red trimmed lesions. And the third one is the chronic one is discoid lupus erythematosus, which is a severe condition when you have to consider it with acute or subacute. Here you can see the lesions on both the cheeks and the nose, which are mostly circular. It's slightly raised, scaly, hyperpigmented and depigmented patches. You can see both hyperpigmentation and depigmentation here. Hyperpigmentation, depigmentation, in which all dermal appendages are permanently destroyed. So this is what the problem is. In discoid lupus erythematosus, you will be seeing the dermal appendages being destroyed. So it is a bit more dangerous, and the lesions will lead to disfiguration. Whereas in acute and subacute, you won't be seeing the disfiguration, and they will be treated upon the treatment. You will be seeing the lesion being coming down. But here in the discoid lupus erythematosus, which is a chronic dermatitis, you will be seeing a disfiguration. What are the other SLE rashes you can be seeing? They are recurring urticaria or dermatitis or paniculitis, and small ulcerations on the oral or nasal mucosa are also common. So we come into systemic manifestations. You will be seeing renal, pulmonary, cardiac and neurological manifestations. But the most important and the most fatal things are renal manifestations, because these are the most commonly involved organs in the SLE patients, and there are far too many stages. There are 6 types where you will be seeing the renal manifestations being seen, and they are most dangerous. So what you will be seeing is nephritis is usually the most serious manifestation of the SLE. As I was saying, patients with dangerous proliferative forms of glomerular damage usually have microscopic hematuria and proteinuria, and approximately one half develop nephrotic syndrome, and most people develop hypertension. The hypertension secondary to the renal manifestations, and this hypertension leading to fatal complications is the reason why the renal manifestations are the most common and fatal in the SLE patients. So here you can see there will be proliferative forms of glomerular damage, hematuria, which you can be seeing proteinuria, which you fit into the nephrotic syndrome type, and the people develop hypertension. So how will you classify the lupus nephritis? There are 6 classes. The class 1 is minimal mesangial lupus nephritis. I'll just skip this and I'll just show this diagram. It should be easy for you. Here you can see on the histopathological classification of lupus nephritis, there is minimal mesangial lupus nephritis, which is due to the deposition of immune complexes which are detectable only on immunofluorescence techniques. Normally, when you see, they won't be. But upon immunofluorescence, you will be seeing immune complexes being deposition. As we have been saying, antigen antibody complexes will be formed, and they will come to the bloodstream and be deposited in the renals. The class 2 is mesangial proliferative lupus nephritis. So there will be hypercellularity or mesangial matrix expansion with immune deposits detectable by light microscope. Whereas if you can see on the class 1, light microscopy won't be detecting these things. Only on immunofluorescent techniques you will be able to see the immune complexes. And there is a class 3. The class 3 is can be segmental or global extracapillary glomerulonephritis involving less than 50% of the glomeruli. And the class 4 is involving more than 50% of the glomeruli. So how the manifestations will be? The manifestations can be either active lesions or chronic inactive lesions or chronic lesions. So when we come to the class 4, if you can see, focal lupus nephritis is class 3 and diffuse lupus nephritis is class 4. So when there is more involvement, that is more than 50% of the all glomeruli involving, and there is subendothelial immune deposits, then you can call it as diffuse lupus nephritis. Just go back. See, the class 3 will be having active lesions, active and chronic lesions, or chronic inactive lesions. So, active lesions are focal proliferative lupus nephritis, whereas active and chronic are focal proliferative and sclerosing lupus nephritis, and whereas the chronic one is focal sclerosing lupus nephritis. And the class 4, the diffuse lupus nephritis, as we have spoken, it's more than 50% involvement of all the glomeruli. Now this is also divided into diffuse segmental lupus nephritis when there is more than 50%, or diffuse global lupus nephritis when it is involving more glomeruli having global lesions. Segmental is the segmental lesions, whereas the global lupus nephritis is global lesions. So what is segmental? The segmental is defined as glomerular lesion that involves less than one half of the glomerular duct. This class includes cases with diffuse wire loop deposits but with little or no glomerular proliferation. As I was speaking, there is no glomerular proliferation in segmental lesions, but it is a glomerular lesion that involves less than one half of the glomerular duct. Okay? And the class 5. The class 5 is membranous lupus nephritis, and the class 6 is advanced sclerosis lupus nephritis. So the membranous lupus nephritis can be global or segmental. The class 6 is advanced, which is more fatal, and it involves more than 90% of the glomeruli globally. Here you can see more than 90% of the glomeruli being involved. That means that most of the kidney is damaged, and the only treatment that you can give in the class 6 is renal replacement therapy or the renal transplantation. Now we'll move on to the neurological manifestations. So the most common manifestation of the lupus nephritis is cognitive dysfunction. This includes with memory and reasoning defects. The headache may also be seen, but the seizures of any type may be caused by lupus. The psychosis is the dominant manifestation. The point here we should remember is it includes cognitive dysfunction leading to memory defects and reasoning defects. And you may be seeing molar polyneuropathy, stroke, and TIA. This is due to the hypercoagulability states, or maybe secondary to the involvement of the cardiac involvement leading to valvular lesions. Here you can also see a embolus formation and lead to stroke or TIA. Or there you can be seeing aseptic meningitis, mostly due to the inflammation that we were speaking about, the chronic inflammation and myelopathy. So the important point here in nervous manifestations or the neurological manifestations are the cognitive dysfunction, including memory and reasoning defects. There could be seizure attacks, and the seizure attacks could be secondary to the stroke or could be the secondary to the emboli formation leading to CSPT and other conditions. Next, the vascular occlusions. As I was saying, the transient ischemic attacks and strokes could be due to the occlusion of the vascular vessels. That could be due to the antiphospholipid antibodies, which leads to hypercoagulability and acute thrombotic events. Ischemia in the brain can be caused by focal occlusion or the embolization from the carotid artery, as I was saying previously, from the endocarditis or due to the involvement of the valvular lesions. Next, hematological manifestations. Here you will be seeing anemia, leukopenia, lymphopenia, and thrombocytopenia. This you can see here, there is pancytopenia picture in the patients with SLE. By this you can say there could be a marrow involvement, the suppression of the bone marrow, and there is a lymphadenopathy, splenomegaly, and hemolytic anemia. The hemolysis of the anemia also leads to anemia, and there is a leukopenia and lymphopenia, which could be secondary to the splenomegaly. Now, pulmonary manifestations. So, the most common pulmonary manifestation of SL is pleuritis, the involvement of pleura leading to inflammation, and they can present with or without pleural effusion. The patients present with chest pain, and they'll be with SLE patients will be presenting chest pain, and when you examine, there won't be any pleural effusion at all. The inflammation of the pleura leading to pleuritis, leading to pain, is what you will be seeing. But the life-threatening pulmonary manifestation include interstitial inflammation. This leads to leads to fibrosis. So the fibrosis leads to shrinking lung syndrome and intra-alveolar hemorrhage. So the most commonly they present with pain that is secondary to pleuritis, but chronic when the patient is having SLE for far too many years and is not on treatment or the treatment is not compliant, you will be seeing the patient developing fibrosis secondary to interstitial inflammation, and there will be something called shrinking lung syndrome, and you can be seeing intra-alveolar hemorrhage, which are life-threatening. Now we will move on to cardiac manifestations. So, which is the most commonly involved? The pericardium is the most commonly involved, leading to pericarditis. But the most serious manifestations are seen when there is involvement of myocardium and fibrinous endocarditis of Lippmann-Sachs endocarditis. So, when there is an endocardial involvement, it leads to valvular insufficiencies. Which are the most commonly involved valves? The most commonly involved valves are mitral and aortic valves. And I was saying previously, when there is a valvular involvement, we commonly see embolus formation. And when there is an embolic event, we will be seeing the secondary effects such as stroke or TIA. So this is how the cardiac manifestations will also be leading to neurological manifestations. Here you can see this is a non-infective endocarditis. That's the first thing you should remember. This is a non-infective thrombotic endocarditis involving mitral valve and systemic lupus erythematosus. So here you can see nodular vegetations along the line of the closure extending onto cardiac tendinate. Okay, these are the cardiac manifestations. So what are the gastrointestinal manifestations? Mostly the gastrointestinal manifestations are non-specific, but the vasculitis, when there is an involvement of vascular and vasculitis is seen, you may be seeing intestinal perforation, ischemia, bleeding, or sepsis. There could be abnormal liver enzymes, but which is not specific to SLE. It could be due to secondary involvement of other organs. And what are the ocular manifestations? We will be seeing Sicca syndrome, or you can be seeing conjunctivitis, episcleritis, retinal vasculitis, or optic neuritis. So the most important manifestation, the clinical manifestation that you need to remember is, just a minute, I'll come. Are you people able to hear me? Can you people hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
And slides, right? Okay, I'll continue then. You are able to hear me, right? And you can see the slides also. I think someone can react.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So now we are finished with the clinical manifestations. The pathology was genetic involvement leading to immune complex formation secondary to T and B cell hyperproliferation and complement involvement, where the autoantibodies are against direct autoantibodies or immune complexes being formed, which leads to inflammation. In the inflammation, when for a long time the chronic inflammation, you will be seeing the systemic involvement of organ dynamics. The most important clinical manifestations are renal involvement, where you will be seeing 6 classes, and the lupus nephritis, we call it as, and the 6 classes leading to proteinuria, or some people may having nephrotic syndrome, and the secondary effects of the renal involvement, and the neurological manifestations, where the cognitive dysfunction is the most important. So, how do you want to diagnose the disease, and how do you want to treat it? So, as we were speaking previously, the anti-nuclear antibodies are one of the mainstay of the laboratory diagnosis tests. As we have seen, anti-double-stranded DNA, anti-Smith, anti-Rho, anti-La, that we were speaking previously. That's what you will try to figure it out, which antibody that you are seeing in this patient. And then you will be seeing for the complete blood picture count. As we have seen, there will be a picture of pancytopenia, like you will be seeing anemia, leukopenia, or lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia. And because of the formation of immune complexes along with the complement system involvement, you will be seeing low serum complement, especially C3 will be low. And when there is a positive direct Coombs test, that is most commonly we'll see in hemolytic anemias. And the urine analysis, when there is an involvement of the renal system, we will be seeing hematuria and proteinuria. There you can be seeing this RBC Cas and the protein. And when there is a glomerular involvement and there is a damage of the renal, then you will be seeing the creatinine being increased. So then how do you want to follow the disease course? Along with this routine test, interferon-inducible gene expression in peripheral blood cells. These are not commonly done investigations, but these are also required when there is a disease course to follow the disease course. Or the serum levels of B lymphocyte stimulator normally increase, and the urinary levels of TNF like weak inducer apoptosis or neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalcinin or monocyte chemotactic protein 1. So the most important thing that you have to remember are these things. Of this, the anti-nuclear antibodies is the prime and foremost thing, followed by the blood picture, the complement levels, and the urine analysis, which is also very important in the patients with SLE. And then followed by these tests that you should be able to remember. So how do you want to classify? You want to classify the patient whether he is having SLE or not on the clinical criteria or the immunological criteria. So now that we have done the test, now we have seen the patient, there is something called SLIC criteria and the European League Against Rheumatism, American College of Rheumatology classification criteria. So these are the two criteria that we use for the SLE patients. So what is the main requirement? It should be having a score of more than 4, the SLIC criteria. Of this, one should be a clinical criteria and one should be an immunological laboratory criteria. Or a biopsy proven lupus nephritis with positive ANA, anti-nuclear antibody or anti-double stranded DNA. So what are the clinical criteria things that we have to see? That are acute and chronic cutaneous lupus or oral or nasal ulcers, non-scarring alopecia, we have to remember this, non-scarring alopecia, arthritis, serositis, renal neurological involvement, hemolytic anemia, leukopenia or thrombocytopenia. These are all the things we have seen in the clinical features, and there you can be seeing same as the acute cutaneous lupus involvement, chronic cutaneous lupus involvement, oral or nasal ulcers, or non-scarring alopecia, or serositis, arthritis, renal or neurological involvement, hemolytic anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia. Whereas the immunological criteria involve ANA, anti-DNA, anti-Smith, anti-phospholipid antibody, low complement levels, and direct Coombs test. Next. So here the thing you have to remember is normally in all the hemolytic anemic patients you will be seeing direct Coombs. So a patient with hemolytic anemia already is there and you are doing the Coombs test, then it doesn't fit into this thing. Patient who is not a hemolytic anemic patient, then you are seeing a direct Coombs, then it fits into this immunological criteria. So now we'll see into the European League Against Rheumatism, American College of Rheumatology classification. First, the entry criterion is important. What is the entry criterion? Anti-nuclear antibody titer should be more than 1:80 hepatic Q cells or equivalent positive test. So if it is absent, do not classify as SLE. If present, then this additive criteria should be used. Now, in this additive criteria, how much score should you get? It should be more than 10. Only if the entry criterion is present, that is when you use this criteria of the scoring system. It is similar to SLIC criteria, where you will be seeing the clinical criteria and immunological criteria, but just the difference is the scoring system is different. Whereas if you have seen there, leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, they had a score of 1. But here you will be seeing the score being 3 and 4. So it differs upon what you are seeing. So you should check for what the patient is having, either the renal involvement or the musculoskeletal involvement, and upon that you will be taking the score, and then or the immunological criteria. So the most important thing here is the entry criterion. When the entry criterion is fulfilled, that is the anti-nuclear antibodies is more than 1:80. That's when you use this criteria for scoring system. Or else there is no point in using this. So how do you want to treat SLE? There is no treatment, or you can say there is no cure for SLE. Once the patient is diagnosed with SLE, he has to deal with it. It's just that we have to decrease the involvement of the systemic and all the lesions that lead to all the, the complications. We should be able to suppress them, and we should be seeing that there won't be any involvement or an organ damage. That is the most important thing. The thing is, you should suppress the symptoms and prevent the organ damage. The remissions are there. That is what one you should remember, and there is no cure for SLE. So how do you want to treat it? So there is something called conservative management, and on the conservative management, patient presenting with musculoskeletal complications, there you can be seeing there will be much more. The most common will they will be complaining is of pain, inflammation. There you can give them with analgesics and anti-malarials, like NSAIDs used for arthritis and arthralgia, and anti-malarials. How do you anti-malarials can be used like hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine can also be used reducing dermatitis, arthritis, and fatigue. But the side effects are renal toxic. And the NSAIDs are used in arthritis and arthralgias, but their side effects involve septic meningitis, hypertension, so renal dysfunction. So when a patient of SLE presented to you and is complaining of pain and all, and you want to give him a conservative management, it is important that he is followed up, or else, although the patient is being decreased with the pain, he will be developing the renal dysfunctions or some other dysfunction due to the involvement of the NSAID. So he should be on a follow-up and regularly monitor his renal parameters. So life-threatening, as I was saying previously, renal involvement is most common and it's also life-threatening. So how do you want to treat this lupus nephritis? As we have seen, there are 6 classes. The class 1 and class 2 do not require immunosuppressive treatment, whereas the class 3 and class 4, they require aggressive therapy with glucocorticoids and immunosuppressive agents, whereas the class 5 should be treated in the same way as group 3 or the class 3 and class 4, whereas the class 6, as we have seen, which is the most fatal thing as I was saying previously, requires preparation for renal replacement therapy rather than immunosuppression, because there is no point when there is more than 90% of the glomeruli being involved. You cannot bring them back, so there is no point in giving immunosuppression. So we have decided to give steroids and immunosuppressive therapy. So how to it be given? 500 to 1000 milligrams of methylprednisolone IV daily for 3 days, followed by 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg of prednisolone or equivalent for 4 to 6 weeks. Then there is a maintenance dose ranging from 5 to 10 mg of prednisolone for as many. It depends upon the patient to patient. It is not that one patient may be given 1 week or 2 weeks. It depends on the patient to patient. So may be required for many years. But the main thing is 500 to 1000 mg of methylprednisolone IV daily for 3 days, followed by 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg of prednisolone for 4 to 6 weeks. Then immunosuppressive agents like cyclophosphamide or myclophenolate mofetil. This should be given along with glucocorticoids as induction therapy, followed by maintenance with azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil can be used. The response of the steroids can be seen within the first 24 hours, but the response of the immunosuppressive agents will take time. That is somewhere between 3 to 16 weeks, depending upon the treatment that is initiated. So the mainstay is steroids, and methylprednisolone IV is the treatment of the choice. And the cyclophosphamide and myclophenolate are the immunosuppressive agents that are being given along with the glucocorticoids. That's one thing you should remember. Or else you can be giving cyclosporin and tacrolimus. What does these do? They inhibit the calcium influx and they decrease the production of interleukins 2 and T lymphocytes. When there is a decreased production of interleukins and T lymphocytes, there will be less formation of immune complexes. Or in the patients with proteinuria, you should be giving ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. While these decrease the chance of end-stage renal disease. So the end-stage renal disease can be avoided if you given ACE inhibitors or ARBs only when the patient is having proteinuria more than 500 mg or patient with hypertension. And the newer drugs like anti-CD20 like rituximab or belimumab can be tried in patients who are resistant to standard combination therapies. When you are giving these therapies like cyclophosphamide and all these, and the patient is still not responding, then you can go with this anti-CD20 like rituximab or belimumab. But the important point here is when there is a proteinuria of more than 500 mg, they should receive ACE inhibitors or ARBs, or else the patient will end up in end-stage renal disease. So, as we have seen, the prevalence is more in females and that too in pregnancy. So, just to add a note on the treatment of pregnancy and lupus, the fetal demise is higher in mothers with high disease activity or the mothers who are having antiphospholipid antibodies or active nephritis or anti-Ro antibodies are associated with neonatal lupus consisting of rash, congenital heart block or without cardiomyopathy. So the important thing is when the females with history of SLE are pregnant, the fetal demise is more in the patients with high disease activity and the presence of antiphospholipid antibodies and with active nephritis. So how do you want to treat them? You can treat them with dexamethasone or with hydroxychloroquine. So there are some drugs which are called category A, category B, category D, depending upon the risk the drugs are having on the mother. So category A drugs these are not teratogenic, so they are glucocorticoids, so they can be given. Whereas the category C drugs, which may be teratogenic, like cyclosporin and tacrolimus, but still can be given. Whereas the category D, there is an evidence of teratogenicity, but here the thing is the benefits are more than the risk. So hydroxychloroquine, myclophenolate mofetil can be used. But whereas the category X, the methotrexate should not be given. So the most important treatment drugs are the glucocorticoids in the lupus dermatitis. So as you have seen the dermatitis in the lupus, there is acute, subacute and chronic. So the better way you can stop this is by minimizing the exposure to UV light and using the sunscreens where the SPF is at least of 30 or the topical glucocorticoids and anti-malarials. If even after these there is no response, then you can be using retinoic acid like methotrexate or azathioprine, the cytotoxic agents. In therapy-resistant lupus, when you are given all this and it's a resistant, then you can use topical tacrolimus or systemic dapsone. This is nothing different to the systemic lupus that we have been talking. First, we'll be giving the glucocorticoids and then the immunosuppressive agents, and even then, if it's not being treated, then you'll be giving the tacrolimus and all. So the preventive therapies, how we can do this? The administration of influenza or pneumococcal vaccines to prevent osteoporosis. So what happens when you are giving glucocorticoids for a long time, then you will be seeing patients complaining of osteoporosis and all. For them, you can be giving calcium, vitamin D supplements like and either bisphosphonates or denosumab are given. A treatment with statins will reduce the defects when the patient is having cardiac involvement. So, what is the prognosis? Normally, the survival is good, but there is a poor prognosis when there is involvement of males. So, normally it's very predominant in females. They will be seeing very less predominance in very less involvement in males. So, when there is a male sex or low socioeconomic status, or when there is a renal involvement with creatinine levels more than 1.4, the hypertension, or the patient landing up in nephrotic syndrome or anemia, and antiphospholipid antibodies and hypocomplementemia. So when the SLE patient are having these, then there would be more poor prognosis. But the male involvement of male sex is always a poor prognosis when compared to the involvement of the female sex. So drug-induced lupus. Drug-induced lupus is there are some drugs which lead to involvement or the presence of lupus, and of those the common are antiarrhythmics like procainamide, antihypertensives like pantolizine, or anticonvulsants like carbamazepine. So there are far too many drugs, but these are the common drugs which may lead to the drug-induced lupus. So how does the patient present? The patient presents with fever, malaise, arthritis, intense arthralgia, myalgia. But the rash is not common as we seen in the normal lupus. And the ANA positivity is very high. And as we were saying previously, anti-histone antibodies. The one thing I was stressing there, because the drug-induced lupus patients will be seeing anti-histone antibodies. So how does it differ from the SLEs like this? The presence of anti-histone antibodies and less female predilection and rarely involvement of kidneys or brain. Normally in SLE patients, you will be seeing most commonly involvement of the renal and neurological complications. But in the drug-induced lupus, you will be seeing most commonly of white predominance or less involvement of the kidneys and the brain. So how do you want to manage this thing? Remove the offending drug or low dose of corticosteroids if the disease is severe. The SLE and antiphospholipid syndrome. We were seeing this antiphospholipid syndrome we were speaking about in the clinical features, or we were speaking about in the investigations, the management we were getting everywhere. So what happens? The antiphospholipid syndrome is an autoantibody mediated acquired thrombophilia characterized by recurrent arterial and venal thrombosis. So what happens is because of this antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, we will be seeing formation of emboli and thrombosis formation of emboli. So what happens when there is the formation of emboli in these can be deposited anywhere in the body, leading to complications. So what are the catastrophic APS? Defined as rapidly progressive thromboembolic disease involving simultaneously three or more organs or organ systems or tissues, leading to corresponding functional defects. See, if there is involvement in the brain, you can be seeing stroke, TIA. There could be involvement in the myocardial ischemia, you can be seeing. So it depends upon the way it's being deposited, the emboli, and the complications. So how do you want to criteria? How do you want to fit it? So there is a clinical criteria and laboratory criteria. The clinical criteria is whether it could be vascular thrombosis or pregnancy morbidity. So when antiphospholipid antibody syndrome leads to loss of pregnancy, and most commonly you will be seeing like death of normal fetus at more than 10 weeks or premature birth at less than 34 weeks due to preeclampsia, or more than 3 consecutive abortions at less than 10 weeks, or placental insufficiency at less than 34 weeks. So this is something you should remember. It's very important. Pregnancy morbidity, death of normal fetus, which is more than 10 weeks age, or premature birth at less than 34 weeks due to preeclampsia, or more than 3 consecutive abortions at less than 10 weeks, or placental insufficiency less than 34 weeks. Then we will move on to laboratory criteria: presence of anti-cardiolipin, whether IgG or IgM, anti-beta-2 glycoprotein, or lupus anticoagulant. The most important thing that you should remember is the pregnancy morbidity. That is important. So how do you want to treat it? The first thrombotic event should be placed on warfarin for life, and the INR should be ranging between 2.5 to 3.5, or they can be given in along with combination of 80 mg of aspirin daily. The point here important is warfarin for life. Sorry, the warfarin for life with an INR ranging from 2.5 to 3.5. Whereas in pregnancy and SLE patients with prior fetal losses, low molecular weight heparin with low dose of aspirin 80 mg daily is also used. Or IV immunoglobulins of 400 mg per kg for 5 days may also prevent abortions. There is a condition where we will be giving heparin and this heparin leads to thrombocytopenia. So what happens there? In cases where heparin-induced thrombocytopenia is seen, which is a complication of heparin dose, you can be giving fondaparinux subcutaneous or rivaroxaban, which is a 10A factor inhibitor, per oral daily, which are effective. Some patients with antiphospholipid syndrome and patients gaps have recurrent thrombotic events despite appropriate anticoagulation. The important point here is warfarin should be given for life with the INR ranging from 2.5 to 3.5. So if you want to sum up the treatment, you go for the regular investigations, then the other investigations, then the mainstay of treatment is glucocorticoids, methylprednisolone given at 500 to 1000 mg IV for 3 days, followed by 4 to 6 weeks. Then you will be giving mycophenolate mofetil. If it is patient is still being not treated, then you will be going for tacrolimus, and even then you can give it newer drugs like anti-CD20, rituximab and all. And the patients with proteinuria and hypertension should be given ACE inhibitors and ARBs to prevent the end-stage renal disease. So the mainstay of treatment is steroids, whether it's a cutaneous lesions or systemic lesions. Whereas in antiphospholipid antibody syndrome involvement, warfarin should be given along with aspirin, and the recurrent pregnancy losses you will be seeing low molecular weight heparin being given, and IV immunoglobulins can also be given. So by this, I would like to finish today. So any doubts, any questions that you want to ask me? Is anyone there, or should I finish it off here? Yeah, I would like to finish it off here, and this is the end of the class, and we'll meet next week.